Hey everybody, thanks for joining us here today. I'm very happy to welcome back Joel Wolfson. Hey Joel.
Hey Nicole, thanks. Glad to be back.
And we are happy to have you back. Today Joel is going to be presenting creative visualization from mind's eye to final image. So very excited to see what he has to share with us today. So with that, let me tell you a little bit more about Joel and then I'll hand it over to him. So Joel conducts photo workshops worldwide, from his native Southwest to Italy, France, and other locales. Definitely check out some of his upcoming sessions too on his website. I know he has a lot of fun ones coming up. He takes his participants to amazing places they wouldn't find on their own for capturing stunning images and employs a unique progressive learning experience along with critiques and reviews to improve one's photography while having a great time, which is always important. Joel's roster of notable clients include Newsweek, Elle, 17, Houghton Mifflin, and corporate clients such as Apple, AT&T, 3M, United Airlines, and Pillsbury. His technical articles on digital imaging have been translated for use in more than 30 countries, yet he is always best known for his artistic images and unexpected views of everyday places around the globe. We are happy to have him back with us again. So with that, let me go ahead and hand it over to Joel.
Okay, welcome everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen here, and
We
thank
can.
you. Great, great. Thank you for joining us. It's really great to be back doing another webinar with Topaz, and today we're going to address one of those seemingly elusive concepts for photographers: visualization. And visualization being simply the mental process of seeing that final image in your mind's eye prior to even taking the exposure. So this basically takes into account everything that you can do to the image, from capture all the way through software plugins, your output, all that sort of thing. And what I'm going to do is show you sort of my bread and butter tools and how I get from point A to point B. So how I get from that concept in my mind and seeing what I want as my final image in my mind to actually getting to that final image. I say the process of visualization seems elusive, but it's not as hard as you think. In fact, everybody has that ability. If you just think about the times you've gone out on a photo shoot, or maybe you're on vacation shooting pictures, and you get back and look at your photos in your image browser, and you might say, wow, I really nailed that one, or you might say, that isn't really what it looked like or what it felt like or what I intended. You've already gone through a process of visualization. So hopefully you've nailed it, but if you haven't, you've definitely had some idea in your mind what it was supposed to be. And that's really the whole idea behind visualization. So the idea is, over time, if you practice a lot, is that you'll sort of hone this process and it'll become second nature. And one way of doing that is thoroughly learning all your tools, and not just your camera, but all your software tools. And this may sound sort of counterintuitive, but the reason I learn my camera so well and all my software tools so well is so I don't have to use them. Now, obviously I do have to use them at some point, but I can be most efficient if I know them thoroughly. So what I'm going to do is take you through a couple of images. If we have time, I can do more, but I'll at least get you through a couple, and I'm going to start with an easier one first, and then we'll go to a more difficult one. So the first image I have here I call La Fontaine, which is French for the fountain. And at first glance, you might not notice the fountain, but the idea behind this image was I was scouting for a workshop in Provence. I shot this in southern France in the Provence region, and there's all these neat little villages with these built, stone buildings and stone walkways and stuff that are, hundreds, if not over 1,000 years old. And they could be people's homes, people's shops, whatever. So I like this little vignette here. I wanted to avoid the cliche thing of shooting the fountain front and center with maybe the shops and homes in the background, and I liked the look of this part right here. And so what I did is I adjusted my angle and picked my perspective and lens, etc., my exposure, all that sort of thing, to get that fountain reflected in the window. So this is my little reward to the viewer when they're looking at a print of this, is they might not notice the fountain on first glance. Excuse me. But I want them to notice it once it catches their eye. So um, that was the idea behind this, and this is what I visualize. It's not as difficult as some other visualization, like say trying to visualize black and white, because we see in color. Sometimes it's more difficult for us to visualize grayscale and tones instead of the color, and we'll go through one of those. And sometimes you might even visualize doing something like converting your photo into something that looks more like a painting. All of that is that same process of visualization. So let's start with this one that's a little bit more straightforward. Now what I want to show you is what this looked like before. So this is my raw capture right here, and you can see it's dull and flat, and that's pretty typical of raw captures. Raw is a great way to do things because you're getting all of the information from the camera. It adds to the difficulty a little bit because when you bring up those raw files in your image browser after the shoot, they do look flat and certainly less interesting and less realistic than what you might have remembered or what you intended. So we need to take this raw image and eventually get it to this point. Now, one thing I'll recommend that does help with the visualization process is, although it's best to shoot raw photos, shoot JPEG along with it, and you can use the JPEG as your reference file. So in other words, you set up your parameters for your JPEG images, and you can customize it if you like it a little more vivid, a little more contrasty. You can set all that on your camera. Almost all modern cameras have that ability. And you can always go back and use that as somewhat of a reference. It'll give you a reference for color and saturation and that sort of thing. Obviously, if there's other things you're doing to the image, it may not take you as far as you want to go, but it's a good starting point, and the whole mental process and visual process of going back and forth will help. The best thing I can say is practice, 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 and that's any aspect of photography, including visualization. But if you practice a lot, it'll become second nature. It's kind of like a visual workout if you go out and shoot every day. So I'm starting in Lightroom, and that's kind of my hub for my digital photo life, so to speak. It's where I keep all my images. And Lightroom is neat because it allows you to do everything from keywording all the way through the basic adjustments that you would do on most images. I'm going to be working in the Develop module. And the layout here, for those of you that are familiar with Topaz plugins, is somewhat similar. We have kind of the bookkeeping on the left. In fact, you'll see, if you follow my cursor over on the left here, there's a little window for presets and collections. And those are both things that you'll see in Topaz plugins. So this is just kind of an added bonus, but going back and forth with Topaz plugins, it all kind of feels familiar. And then I have all my tools on the right. And what my goal is to be most efficient is any adjustments that I can do in Lightroom, I do in Lightroom. If I know from experience or experimenting with the sliders in Lightroom that it just isn't going to cut it, and I need something more specialized like Topaz Detail or Clarity or something like that, then I'll go into that plugin and use those tools to refine my image. So the way Lightroom is set up, it's intended to be a top-down design, and for the most part that works. And by that I mean you can start at the top and literally go down. So if you look where my cursor is over on the right here, we've got white balance, exposure, contrast, all of those things that you would probably adjust initially with your image. The one thing that I consider to be slightly out of place is the sharpening. If I scroll down to the bottom here, this is where sharpening is. Why do I say that's out of place? That's because, as a rule, you want to do your capture sharpening as a first step. Sharpening uses contrast to give you the illusion of making things sharper, and so it kind of interplays with contrast adjustments, and especially a plugin like Clarity, which I'm going to be showing you shortly. So the very first thing I want to do is sharpen my image. And the reason I want to do that with almost every image is because something is lost in the translation. Virtually every camera out there has an anti-aliasing filter, and even if it doesn't, you sometimes lose a little sharpness just through the whole process of the capture and the camera itself. So you notice this little exclamation point that lights up when I put over it, the cursor over it. That's telling me that I need to be at 1:1 to set my sharpening. So here's the sharpening control in Lightroom, and that's the first thing I'm going to do. So the parameters here are just like Photoshop. You have the amount of your sharpening. I'll move the slider up so the rest of them are lit up. And then you have the radius, which is how many pixels that it looks at from the pixel it's on. It's kind of techie stuff. I wouldn't worry about it too much because I'm going to show you some sort of neat little tips and shortcuts to get through this. And then detail is almost like a flow. It's the amount of sharpening that's, or how heavily handed the sharpening is being applied. And masking allows you to block out things that you don't want to be sharpened. So first we start with the amount. Now you can see if I move this slider all the way over, it's way over sharpened. It's starting to look crinkly and crunchy, and that's not really how we want it to look. And all of the way to the left is no sharpening. Now, sometimes color distracts us from sharpening, so I'm going to show you a little tip in Lightroom, and that is to, before you adjust the slider, is to hold down the Option key or Alt on a PC. So Option on a Mac, Alt on a PC, and then as soon as I click on the slider, it immediately turns to a grayscale image. What it's really doing, I think, is showing you the luminance channel, but you're not distracted by the color, and I can start moving this slider over until I get roughly the sharpening that I want. So I want to compromise between looking nice and crisp but not kind of over crunchy. So 60 is kind of a good starting point. Now for the radius, I can use that Option key again, and if you're going, well, how the heck do I know where to set the radius? Hold down the Option key, click on it, and you get this sort of solarized, excuse me, this solarized looking image. If I bring it to the left and then slowly start moving it to the right, what I do as soon as I start to see a change, so in this case it's right around 0.7, that's going to be my optimum radius. And this is in measuring in tenths of a pixel how far out it looks to the next pixel. Detail is a similar idea. Again, I'm going to hold down the Option or Alt key on a PC, bring it to the left. Now, those of you that ever worked in a film darkroom will understand what I mean when I say reticulation. But basically, if I move this all the way over, do you see how it's still very gray, but in the smooth areas it starts to get crinkly, for lack of a better term. There's a good technical term for you. So I start at the left and start moving it to the right, and I'm going to look at the door panel right over here, because that's a fairly smooth area. Whoops, wrong slider. Go back to my detail slider, and as I move it over, just about when it starts to get that crinkly look is when I stop, and this is going to be the optimum for my sharpening. So now just looking at this 1:1, that's looking good. Some of you may be asking, well, why didn't Joel use the masking slider? And that's because there's nothing I really want to mask out here. Now, if you're doing a landscape where you have blue sky, it's a solid color. You don't want to sharpen that because it's just going to end up adding noise to the sky. Likewise, a portrait where you have smooth skin, you want to sharpen the eyes maybe and the lips and things like that, but not the skin. That's what this masking allows you to do. It creates contour. So again, if you hold the Option key, move this over, you can see if we pretend the door panel is blue sky, as we move this slider over, it suppresses that. It's black, so it's whatever's black is going to block sharpening, whatever's white is going to sharpen, and it creates what's called a contour mask. So it's showing the edges of contrast, which is what we want to sharpen. However, in this case, this door actually does have grain in it and texture, and there really isn't anything in this image that I don't want to sharpen. So in this case, I'm not going to use the mask. But it's a pretty nifty tool if you're doing a landscape or something like that. And I can't remember if I mentioned this, but if I were to put a statistic on how often I use the sharpening in Lightroom, I'd say it's about 1/4 to 1/3 of the time. A lot of times I will go to Topaz Detail to do my capture sharpening. I definitely will use creative sharpening sometimes in Lightroom as well, but for the capture sharpening, this doesn't always work all the time. For this particular image, it works pretty well, and so I'm going to use it because this is the most efficient way to do it. I don't have to jump into a separate plugin and create another layer and that sort of thing. So there's my sharpening, and I want to go back to my image. Now at this view I can't actually see the sharpening, but I know it's well sharpened. And the next thing I want to do is bring up the saturation because as we know, this image is flat. Comparing it back to our where we want to go. Um, and you'll be able to tell right off the bat when you look at your raw images that they are a little mundane compared to what you remembered. So let's bring up the saturation. There's a few ways to do that in Lightroom, and what I'm going to start with, if we go back to our basic panel, you see there is a saturation slider. As I move that over, things get a lot more saturated. But what happens is when I bring the walls back to the color they're supposed to be, the saturation, I should say, when they're at that vividness where they're really supposed to be, which is right around here roughly, these flowers, I'm going to blow this up a little bit. These flowers on the rose bush here are a little overly vivid. So there's a better control for this particular case, and that's the vibrance slider right above saturation. So I'm going to double click saturation to zero it out. I'm going to go into vibrance. Now what vibrance does, it's a little bit like saturation boost in Topaz plugins, if you're familiar with those already. Vibrance boosts the lesser saturated colors. And the other thing it does, interestingly, is it suppresses saturation in a lot of the yellow areas, yellow-orangey areas, which comprise oftentimes skin tones. And the reasoning behind that, of course, is so you can saturate an overall image without making the skin tones look all whacked out. So I'll use the vibrance slider, and I'm going to bring that over as the walls start to get about where they're supposed to be. The flowers and the plants look relatively natural too. So probably, I don't know, I'm going to be somewhere around maybe 30-ish on my vibrance. I probably still have to do a little more work on the walls. What's happening here is the vibrance is doing a little bit of what the saturation was doing, in that when I bring the wall up exactly to where I want it to be, the flowers go a little too vivid, but I'm close. So there's another tool called the target tool in Lightroom. So I'm scrolling down to where it says HSL here. So what the target tool does is when I click on it, I get a little crosshatch, and whatever I put that over, it will adjust that color. And I can adjust the hue, the saturation, and the luminance of just that color. So you can do that by clicking and holding down your mouse and moving it up and down, or if you have a scroll wheel, you can do that. So I'm going to go over here, click on saturation, because that's what I want to do first, move it over to the wall, and start moving it up. And you can see it's just saturating the yellows and nothing else. So I want to bring my yellow wall approximately to where it should be. And this is saturation wise, like so how vivid the color is. Now when I get it about where I want it to be, which is roughly in this, you can see just the yellow and orange sliders moved over. So I have roughly the right saturation. Maybe I'll bring it down just a hair. But the color is a little off. It looks a little green to me. So what I can do is go over to the hue, put my target tool back there again, and then move those yellows and oranges, make them a little more yellow. You see if I go in one direction, they go greener. If I go in the other direction, they go more magenta. So I just want them, the wall was originally sort of yellow, maybe peachish color. So I want to get a little bit closer to that. Okay, so there I am. Now I'm ready to go into clarity. I've got most of the adjustments I can do here. Now, the one thing I'm going to want to do with this, and the reason I use clarity most of the time, is to add depth to the image. So our colors are maybe about right, but we don't have the image is flattened in terms of a third dimension, and that's what where clarity really sings. You can really tweak the contrast all the way through from low contrast areas to high contrast areas, and get precisely what you want. In terms of having done some adjustments on here, it's not exactly where I want it, but I'm not going to worry about that because I can really tweak it in Clarity. So to get into Clarity, we either have to go through a program like Photoshop, we can go directly into it from Lightroom. My little rule of thumb that those of you who've attended my webinars know, if I'm just going to do one plugin one time, or one plugin per image, then I would do it directly out of Lightroom. However, I'm going to be using Clarity a couple of times, which is the equivalent of using two plugins, so I'm going to do it through a program that has layers like Photoshop. So I right-click down here on the thumbnail, or I can right-click on the image itself, or I can go up to the photo menu, a lot of different ways to do this, say Edit In, it's the same menu, all these different scenarios, bring it into Photoshop, and yes, I definitely want to edit a copy of it, and I want to keep those Lightroom adjustments. And here, looks like I had this open already, so I'm going to, sorry about that, folks. I didn't want to give you the wrong image there. So I'm going to go under Photo, I'm going to do Edit In, Photoshop, do my copy, and it opens that image into Photoshop with my Lightroom adjustments. The first thing I want to do is to duplicate the layer. So this is my main, over in the lower right here, if you see my cursor, the layer that says background is my main image. A little shortcut here, if I drag and drop that down to the dog ear icon, that'll immediately duplicate the layer. The reason I'm doing this is so that I don't do anything to my base image in case I need to go back to it. I'm going to work on a copy of it. So I like to label these with what I'm doing. I'm going to call this one Clarity, and I'm going to say Add Depth because this is what I'm the purpose of going into Clarity. And to get into Clarity, we go up to the filter menu here, go down to Topaz Labs. Here are all my Topaz plugins, and then I simply select Clarity, and it's going to open that image into the Clarity plugin. Now, it looks kind of awful there, and that's because what happens with Topaz plugins is they always default to where they were the last time. So I don't remember what image I was working on here, but it doesn't apply to this one. So what I do every time I open one of these plugins is I hit reset, and that starts with my base image. So my color and saturation are pretty close to where I want to be, and I did all that in Lightroom. But what I want to adjust is the dynamics here. These are the sliders for contrast, and you can see it's divided up. This is over on the right-hand side. Just a quick interface review here, or for those of you that are new, the layout is very similar in all the Topaz plugins. Over on the left-hand side here, we have collections, which are collections of presets. Presets are a combination of settings that Topaz has put together for you. You can also create your own. So either the ones they provide or ones you want to use over and over, you can simply click on them, and they will apply that particular preset. I can click on House and Lawn here. I can go to General, pick High Contrast and Color Pop. And sometimes those may work out for what you want, but I'm going to do this manually because I want to be able to tweak the adjustments. So I'm going to go over to my contrast here. Now, what these represent is it divides contrast into 4 areas, and they do overlap a bit, which is nice because that way everything's kind of blended. Microcontrast is areas of little contrast variation. So it might be a dark and a darker. Things that have very little contrast between them to begin with, and then it goes up from there. So low contrast would be sort of maybe the low midtones, where there's a slight difference in contrast, and medium contrast there's bigger differences, etc. So this is how we can adjust these. So what I generally do is I start with the top with the micro contrast and work my way down. And here, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so you can see what happens a little easier. So I'll start with the micro contrast, and as I move that over, you can see my progress bar keeps going on the bottom, and you can see changes. Now, this is a little more than I want on the micro contrast. And here's what I'll do is, there's the before. Now this is kind of subtle because we're only working on the very low contrast areas, and then this is the after. But look in the area of the door here, it's easier to see. So there's my before image, and there's my after image. So we're off to a good start here. I'm going to move it into the low contrast. So those are areas that have a little more contrast than the micro. And we're starting to get a little more pop here. More importantly, we're getting more sense of a third dimension. I'm going to add a little bit of the medium contrast, which is the areas that have more obvious contrast. And what you can see happening here, here's my before image, very flat looking, a lot more depth to this, but what's happening too is as I'm increasing contrast, obviously I'm increasing dark, so some of the dark areas are getting darker, and um, in a sense, in the extremes, there's almost too much contrast between the very dark areas and the very light areas. And so when I go to the high contrast slider, believe it or not, I'll often go to the minus side, and that kind of evens it out without losing all the other contrast adjustments I've done. So as I move this over, you can see it's kind of smoothing it out, and it doesn't have that altered look to it, essentially. If I go back to no adjustment, or I were to move it in the other direction, you can see it looks overcooked and it just looks unnatural. So in a lot of cases, I will actually move this to the minus. And this is something you just need to play around with and get used to it. But now it's starting to have a little bit more natural look. The only other thing I might do is go down to the tone level and bring up my blacks just a little bit. So I'm going to bring those up. And if you look in the dark areas of the window, you can see how it brought it up. I'll go back to no black level, and I'll bring that up again roughly to where I was. So now I have a fairly natural looking image. I'm going to go back to the overall so you can see it here. There's my before, there's my after. Now it's somewhat subtle, but if you take a look at how realistic the steps and the door, and by realistic I mean how much depth there is. Does it look like you can really walk into that? This is the before image we're looking at, and it's still a little bit flat. Compare that now with the after, you really get more of a sense of three dimensions. This plant really looks like it's separated from the wall, and you really get a sense of depth walking up the steps to this door, that sort of thing. So that's really what I'm after. Now, because it's sort of an illusion, but now the whole image has a sense of being slightly underexposed. It's not really. If you look at the before, the exposure is really right on, but we have those dark areas have increased a little bit to a little bit darker, and so it's sort of giving us that sense. So if I boost the midtones a little bit, that'll give the image a little bit of a brighter look. So we're kind of back to where we want to be. All right, so we're pretty much good here overall. The only thing I want to do now, I'm going to say okay, so it's going to apply everything, and we're just about done with this image. What I want to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer again, and I'm going to go right back into clarity, and I'm going to add a little pop to that fountain. If you remember, the fountain was an important part of this, and once the viewer's eye gets that fountain, I really want them to notice it. So I'm just going to label this fountain so I know what I did. I'm going to jump right back into clarity. So I go on the filter menu, Topaz, go up to clarity here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to first do my reset. Remember, I always want to do the reset so that I can start from my base image. And I'm going to magnify this. I'll click on if you notice up on the top center, you can decrease magnification, increase magnification. There's an instant one-to-one button and an instant fit to the screen button. So I'm going to move this over so I can look at just the fountain. Now, mentally, you need to ignore everything else except the fountain. So what I'm going to do is on round 2 of clarity here, I'm mainly going to be dealing with the low and medium contrast because that's really what's in the fountain here. So I'm going to bring that up. I know there's a delay when you guys are seeing this, but I'll wait for it to finish. Okay, so there's the low contrast. Now I'm going to work on the medium contrast until I get it where I like it. Now, the fountain really pops. The rest of it looks awful, but we're going to take care of that through masking as soon as I go back into Photoshop. And the fountain, is a little bit overcooked. The one thing I want to do actually is I'm going to bring up the blacks a little bit because my shadows have gone a little dark in the fountain. I don't want to go too high because if these controls do interact with each other, so if I brought the black level way up, it's going to have the effect of reducing some of the contrast. So I want my shadow. There's my before. There's my after. And I think that fountain is slightly overcooked, but that's okay. I'd rather overdo it a little bit. I can always adjust the opacity later. Now, you can adjust the opacity in right from within this plugin. So if you don't have Photoshop or you want to do it in this plugin, you can, and you can also do masking in this plugin. I'm not going to go into that right now, and I have other webinars archived where I show some of those masking techniques. Topaz has the best masking out there. So if you need something a little more specialized, like their edge aware or color aware capabilities, you can do that from within some of their plugins. In this case, I'm just doing a really highly feathered, very sort of rough kind of mask, and so I'm going to do it right from within Photoshop. So I'm going to say OK here, and this will it processes it, and we jump back into Photoshop, and now the whole thing looks overcooked because we basically overcooked it on the in the plugin. So what I'm going to do is create a mask and cover this. So I'm going to show you a little Photoshop trick here. Is over on the right here in my panel, you can go down to this quick mask to add a layer mask. And if I hold down the Option key on a Mac, Alt on a PC, it'll not only create the mask instantly, it'll fill it with black. So now I've completely negated the whole effect, and I'm going to selectively brush back in this fountain. So I'm going to go over to the left to my tool palette, grab the brush. I want to go down here and make sure that my foreground color is white because I'm going to white reveals and black hides. I want to reveal the fountain. Now it's not in the correct place. A couple ways to get it back is you can hit the D key for default, or you can hit the X key to exchange foreground and background, or you can simply click on this right here or swap them back and forth with this little icon. So like most things Adobe, there's a million ways to to skin the cat. Now, I'll show you another little trick in Photoshop, and that is for the brush. So my brush size is about right, but if you hold down the Control and Option on a Mac, Alt on a PC, Control and Alt, Control Option, and you click on the mouse and you move left to right, you can change the size. You go up and down with the mouse, and you create the amount of feather. So in this case, I want maximum feather, but I want a little bit smaller brush. And I'm going to magnify in a little more here. And I'm just going to brush, literally brush back in the effect on this fountain that I created in the plugin. Okay, and there we are. Now I still think it's looking slightly overcooked, so I can always go over to this layer in the lower right here, make sure that I have the layer selected, and I go up to the opacity and I can bring it down. Now if I bring it down to 0, you can see there's no effect on the fountain. I bring it all the way to the right, there's 100%. So I'm going to bring it back to about 80%. And I can see a little bit of a dark edge here, so what I can do is I can always go swap these colors again and switch it back to black and just brush out some of the, whoops, what am I doing here? Oh, you know what? I'm brushing on the image itself. Okay, there's something to pay attention to is you want to make sure this white outline is what you have selected. So I want to make sure I'm selecting the mask, and I want to brush out that dark edge on here. So there we are. Once the viewer finds the fountain in this image, it's going to pop for them, which is what I was after. I've got a lot of nice depth from clarity, and so we can just hit save, and it'll save it back into Lightroom. So when I go back into Lightroom here, there's my new image. And what I want to do is show you, I'm going to go into history here and bring this back to where we started with that flat image. So there's where we started, and there's where we ended up. Voila. So I'm going to go to my next image here, and that's this one. this is my final. So this is what I saw in my mind's eye. This is a town called Modica in Sicily. We did our most recent Italian workshop there. That was a really fun workshop. It's a really great area. Uh, but anyway, there's this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and so they're preserving this town the way it was built many hundreds of years ago, and this centuries old nightscape I envisioned in my mind in black and white. Um, so it's an extra step to visualize in black and white, and also night exposures are difficult. So this is our starting exposure. Now I know that my camera can hold more information than I'm going to see on the screen. So there's a lot of information in the highlights and the shadows that I'm not seeing that I need to bring out, and I'm going to primarily use clarity to do that. Now, I'm going to go on the develop module here. Now, you remember before we were able to do some of these adjustments in Lightroom. The catch-22 here is that I know from experience, but I can also show you that if I try some of these sliders, they're really not going to cut it, because these are kind of general sliders, whereas the Topaz plugins allow you to tweak things very nicely, and they're just more specialized, and that's why we use them, because we can't do everything in Lightroom. And likewise, if you have Photoshop, you can do a lot of those things, but it's a lot more time consuming. So if I bring the exposure up to where I have shadows, where I can see detail in the shadows, which is sort of what I envisioned and what I could sort of see with my eye once my eyes adjusted to the night, then it's blown out in the main cathedral in San Giorgio here. So I can't use the exposure slider. Likewise, if I try to move the shadow slider over along with the exposure, I lose my blacks. Okay. So there's my dilemma. There really isn't a good slider in here. Even the clarity, it makes it look really funky. So I know that I need to go use a specialized plugin. So in this case, I'm going to use clarity. So what I do is I right-click, I say Edit in. I'm going to go into Photoshop, edit a copy, and there's my image. Immediately I'm going to go over to my layers palette here and duplicate that layer, and I'm going to label it clarity, and then go to the filter menu and go into clarity here. And again, I want to reset back to my base level of the image, and I'm going to start going through these dynamic sliders, sort of like I did before. So I'm going to start with the micro contrast, and again, let me bring this up. So in this image, what micro contrast is areas of very little variation. That's redundant, I guess. So very little variation right here. So like an area like this where the hand is, or an area here. So here you have a dark and a darker, and here you have a bright and a brighter. So as I bring up the micro contrast, it will probably affect those areas more than it's going to affect other areas. So I'll start bringing that up. Okay, so if I do a before, it's pretty subtle, but there's the before, you know, look in, say, right in here, and there's my after. And so that's the micro contrast. Now I'm going to go to the low contrast and bring that up. That's looking pretty good. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit so we get more of a little bit more of an overall image here. So far, there's my before, there's my after. We're definitely getting that more contrast and depth. And now I'm going to bring the medium up a little bit. And so, as you can see, we certainly have the contrast we're looking for. And just like I did before, the high contrast, I'm going to go to the negative because there's too much really in the high contrast areas. So an area where you can definitely see this is to look at this cathedral. I'll go back to the 0 point there, and you can see those real bright areas are getting kind of blown out because there's almost too much contrast in the areas of great difference, so the brightest brights and the darkest darks. And so by going to the negative on the high contrast, we can equalize that a little bit. Now I'm still lacking a little bit in the shadows there, so what I want to do is bring up my black levels, and that'll help bring up those shadow areas quite a bit. Okay, so um, we're almost there. I'm going to bring the white level down just a hair, again to kind of maintain a little more detail in those really bright areas. Now, I think I might bring the black level up even a little more. I don't want to go too high with this. All right, so there's my before, there's my after. I'm definitely getting, I have a sense of depth, I think, and I'm also getting more, certainly a lot more detail in those darker areas, which is something I was after here. And the next thing I want to do before to prep this for black and white is to oversaturate it. Now, why do I do that? I've found over time, and those of you that have seen my webinars before, you know that the more uh, when the image looks a little bit gaudy in color, it makes a pretty good conversion of black and white. So I tend to make them a little over contrasting and a little over saturated to begin with, and then I tweak it in black and white effects. So what I'm going to do here is go into my hue saturation, and this looks very familiar, right? It looks a lot like the one on Lightroom. I'm going to click on saturation, and I'm just going to take my overall saturation and bring it up quite a bit. Okay, now if I were going to leave this a color image, that's probably a little too saturated and slightly too contrasty, but you'll see when we convert to black and white, it'll make a pretty decent conversion. And then we can just tweak it. So I'm going to say okay. Okay, and it processed it back into Photoshop. There's my clarity layer. Now I want to take, just to give you a before and after, let me bump up the magnification just a little bit. All right, so there's where we started. There's where we ended up, at least with the clarity adjustments. Now I'm going to duplicate that clarity layer. That's going to be my starting point for black and white effects, and I'm going to label my layer appropriately so that I remember what I did if I go back to this layered file. And again, we go into the filter menu, and this time we're going to pick black and white effects. And black and white effects prepares all the previews. So again, the first thing I do is run down here to the lower right, hit the reset, and this is my starting point. So this is the sort of the default generic black and white conversion. Now, like the other plugins, you have collections of presets on the left, and you can go through these as a starting point, and I highly recommend that if you're new to a plugin, is to check out some of those presets, because a lot of times they'll work. Just as an example, we're in the traditional collection. If I click on this little grid box, it'll do just that. It'll put all my options in the grid, and I can just scroll through these and pick one out. So a lot of times my favorite for black and white ends up being the classic, and that's not bad. That's really close to what I might want, but I do want to tweak it a little bit. So I kind of want to do this one manually, so I am going to go back to my reset here, and I'm going to go into my conversion into adaptive exposure, and I'm going to adjust adaptive exposure here. So what adaptive exposure does is it literally is adaptive. So instead of just increasing or decreasing exposure, you can bring up shadows without sacrificing highlights and vice versa. The regions, it simply divides the image up into sections, equal sections, so it's like sort of like a piece of graph paper. Let me magnify this a little bit so you can see a little bit easier. Because almost if you take any given section out of this image, it's very similar to any other given section, with the exception of this cathedral, the main cathedral, and some of the really bright areas. So you're not going to see a big difference in regions once you get past a certain point. But if I go all the way to 1, it's treating the whole image as 1, and it's a little harder to equalize it. So I do want to divide it up somewhat. And as I move this along, if I go much past about 20, you're not going to see much of a difference. But I did, you notice dividing it up to say this 20 here versus the 1, it does equalize those really bright areas better. So this is a good starting point. In fact, this is very close to what I want now. Let me go to the overall. The only thing is, I want to this protect shadows. As I move that over, you can see by protect it means it's maintaining detail in the shadows. Right at this point, I am losing a little detail in the shadows, but if I go too far over here, I lose my blacks. There's a neat little tool in this, the zone system tool. So if I enter the zone system tool, I can look at the different zones. The zone system divides it into 10 levels, 0 through 9, 0 being the blackest black, 9 the brightest white, and everything else in between. And each step is like an f-stop. Each step is double or half the amount of light. So it's a neat system originally popularized by Ansel Adams. And the reason I'm going to use this is because I want to make sure I don't lose those blacks. So you see if I click on 0, it's shading in purple what's black, and I want to, you can see as I up this protect shadows, even just 1/100th at a time, you can see when I go to 5, 0.05, I've totally lost my blacks. This is a night scene, so I don't want to do that. So my optimum here is about 0.02. So there's my before with the black and white, okay? And there's my after. I've got lots of detail. I still have rich blacks in there. I have bright, I have bright whites with these lights, but I have a lot of detail in that cathedral, even though that's one of the brightest objects in there. So from a zone system or printing perspective, it's a well-balanced image. So I'm going to say OK. And then I'm going to save this back to Lightroom. And what I want to show you is where we started and where we ended up. Okay, so that was my initial exposure, and remember I visualized this as a black and white. I just like that classic look of black and white, especially in dealing with a subject like this, which is hundreds of years old, and except for the street lights, of course, has kind of an old world feel to it. In the old days, those might have been gas lamps or people using candles in their windows and that sort of thing, but I just like that black and white feel. And you really, when it goes to the black and white, it really has a nice sense of depth. And that's really the magic of clarity and also, to some extent, the adaptive exposure in black and white effects. So that combination really gives it a nice effect. So that's where we started. That's where we ended up. And I'm looking at the time here, and I want to leave some time for questions. So why don't we jump into questions, and we'll go from there.
All right. Thank you so much, Joel. Appreciate it. I had quite a few people ask if you could kind of expand on the visualization aspect of how do you visualize it in the beginning? Is it just something that you automatically see, or how can you start working that method a little bit more?
Okay, well, that's an excellent question. So visualization, as I mentioned early on, everybody sort of has it, but it's something you can develop. So in terms of the way I visualize, honestly, it can vary from a vague idea to a very precise notion. And I would say the better you get at it, the more precise your visualization will be. In other words, for instance, this black and white image that's up on the screen, once you get good at this, you can really see that in your mind's eye. When I first started in photography, I was a young teenager. I learned that was Ansel Adams was my hero in the group F64, and I read about visualization and learned how to do it. So we have more tools now to help you do that. So you can sit there in Lightroom and just toggle back and forth let me go to a color image. Um, Up here, there's this black and white control and develop module, and there's similar things in other, in Photoshop and other browsers and stuff. This one's pretty instantaneous, so I can toggle back and forth between color and black and white. And there's, if we go down to the black and white, there's this auto tone button too, and sometimes that gives you a little better effect. So one way you can practice this is just using a tool like this. So um, look at a color image, close your eyes, try to see it in your mind's eye as a black and white, what red might look like as a tone and what blue might look like as a gray tone, etc. And that's a way you can kind of hone this skill. The other way is you can chimp with your camera. Let's say you're trying to visualize black and white. Set your camera up for black and white. You can still shoot raw, and the raw image is going to contain color information. But on the spot right there, you can look at the back of your camera right after you shoot and see a black and white version. Now, it might not be that accurate, but the more often you do these little mental exercises, the better you'll be at visualization. Um, and the same way with a color image. You might, and it depends how far you take the visualization. If you're going to alter an image a lot, um, you want to try to be able to see that in your mind's eye. And the other component of this is really knowing your tools well. So if you practice a lot with a plug-in or your, say, Lightroom or whatever, it's really just practice, practice, practice. So once you do that, you'll have an idea what you can do with these tools. And the magic, so to speak, of visualization is once you get good at it, it happens virtually instantaneously. So in a fraction of a second, you can see it in your mind's eye, and you might not be thinking out every step of the way anymore. It might be more automatic. So you might not be thinking, okay, I know it's going to look like this in black and white, and that I can do such and such in black and white effects, and I can tweak the detail using Topaz detail, etc. So it's really a combination of factors. But if you break it down like I just did, where you kind of break down the visualization to the first part, which is the capture, and then your software tools, and practice with each of those, you'll get a lot better at it.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I think that really explains really well how to practice visualization, because we have a lot of people questioning, how do I actually start to see, the possibilities, and just working with these tools is exactly how I do it as well. So awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
Let's see here. We have Vanessa asking, what is your favorite Topaz plugin at this point?
Very good question. Honestly, that's a tough one to answer because it's a little bit image dependent. But in terms of, good all-around plugins, I would have to say my three top ones are probably Detail, Black and White Effects, just because I love black and white and I do a lot of it, and um, did I say Detail? Clarity, Detail, and Black and White Effects. Those are probably my favorites. Adjust is up there. I've found that now that Detail is out, I'm probably using that more than Adjust. There are some subtle differences, but you can get similar effects. So Nicole and I were talking about this the other day. With Adjust, you can take it to an extreme and get a real sort of HDR effect, so to speak, a very stylized look. Um, so you won't see those extremes necessarily in clarity. So they're kind of different tools for different jobs. But I know that didn't answer one specific plugin, but
No, that's
if I
great.
had
Thank
if
you.
I had to pick my top two or three, those are them.
Perfect. All right, and I had just an overwhelming amount of questions at the beginning of the session that I don't have a specific person, but it was a lot of people, because a lot of people know about sharpening at the end of your workflow, but I had quite a few people asking, wait, why is he jumping into sharpening at the beginning in Lightroom? So if you kind of want to talk about quickly about why that that was your workflow, that'd be great.
Certainly, I can address that. Um, Actually, with that second image I did, all right, let me start from the beginning. Essentially, sharpening, and most programs use a technique called unsharp masking. It's it's a game of contrast. So essentially, what you're doing is looking at at edges where there is a difference from one pixel to the next, and you're accentuating the difference along those edges, and it gives the illusion of sharpness. Sharpening actually is a workflow in and of itself. It's a three-part process. So there's capture sharpening, which you have to do on virtually every image. There's selective sharpening, which you can use to selectively go in and sharpen something, and that might be just to make up for the fact that a lot of lenses are not as sharp at the edges as they are in the middle, or it might be for a creative effect to accentuate eyes in a portrait, that sort of thing. And then there's output sharpening. You always need the capture sharpening and output sharpening, and the capture sharpening you'll need to a greater or lesser extent depending on the type of camera and everything that you're using. The reason I usually do it in the beginning of the process is because it not only gives the effect of sharpening, it will affect contrast somewhat. So if I go in and do contrast adjustments and things like that, and even saturation to some extent, I and then I go to sharpen, I may not get the image, the detail as sharp looking as I want without making it look over contrasty. So I generally prefer to do the capture sharpening first. Now there are exceptions like that nightscape I just did. Because I was adjusting the contrast in that image so dramatically, I probably would want to save that until the end and do the capture sharpening towards the end of the process. Sometimes, quite honestly, it doesn't matter where you do it in the process. It's kind of image dependent, but the general rule of thumb is you want to do capture sharpening first, then during the process you'll do selective or creative sharpening, and then if you're going to go, then when you go to output, whether it's to a website or whether it's to a printing press or whether it's to your own printer in your studio or your home, you always need to do output sharpening to compensate for loss of sharpening in the printing process or the viewing process. So maybe
Thank
more than you
you.
want to know about sharpening, but
No,
that's the reasoning behind it.
That's a great overview too. I think we have several more questions about the sharpening aspect, and we have several webinars on our YouTube channel that kind of cover certain aspects of the sharpening, but it could be its own tutorial for sure, many tutorials long. So,
speaking of that, Nicole, I will mention that I did a webinar for you guys called Optimizing Output,
yes.
And it's archived on my website on my workshop page, and it's also, I'm sure, on Topaz's YouTube channel. So either one of those places, it's called Optimizing Output. I go into a fair amount of detail of the whole sharpening workflow, how to do it and why you do it. So
yes.
that'll help too for those people that are wondering about sharpening.
Awesome. Thank you so much for going over that and staying after with us as well. Thanks everybody for joining us, and I hope you have a fantastic evening or morning or afternoon wherever you are, and that you're able to join us for an upcoming session. Thanks everyone. Thanks Joel again.
You're welcome.